Welcome to the James for Justice podcast. I'm James Fafelsky, and I'm a criminal defense attorney, have been doing defense work for about 20 years now. I'm also a father, husband, criminal justice reform advocate, and we talk about all things related to the criminal justice system here. And today I want to talk about something that just came up earlier this week, and it has to do with police officer qualified immunity. Just this past Tuesday, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear an appeal where this question of qualified immunity was really the core question because there was a fatal shooting, I think it was back in 2018 in Royal Oak, Michigan, not too far from where I am. And an officer was faced with a situation where apparently the individual he was trying to stop was driving erratically. He had actually pulled him over at one point, but attempted to pull him over several blocks earlier, and the gentleman didn't stop for several blocks. It didn't sound like a high-speed chase, but something similar to that, where ultimately the gentleman stopped for a red light behind several other cars. Police officers right behind him, goes up to his window and says, "Hey, I want you to pull over, stop driving." Once the light turns green, the gentleman takes off. Officer jumps into his patrol car, starts to chase him, sees him go into a White Castle. If you like White Castle burgers, hey, this is an interesting case for you. Gentleman goes into the White Castle the wrong way, kind of against the flow of traffic around the drive-through area, takes off somewhere else. Officers trying to find him, can't locate him, and so he sits and does surveillance nearby the White Castle to see if this other gentleman's going to come by again to drive through or drive into the White Castle parking lot. Lo and behold, 15 minutes later, the gentleman pulls back into the White Castle. He wants to get some food, apparently, gets into the drive-through line, gonna pick up some food, and the officer then drives up right next to his vehicle, essentially to block him in so he can't go anywhere. Gets out of his vehicle, approaches the gentleman, says, "You need to stop, get out of the vehicle." What happens next is when things basically go sideways. A few moments later, the gentleman starts to turn his vehicle, sort of triangulate to get out of that position because he's got a car in front of him and a car behind him. The patrol car's in front of him. There's another citizen in his or her own vehicle right behind him, so he's kind of boxed in, but he's got enough room. He starts to triangulate to get out of there, and the officer at that point is in front of his vehicle telling him to stop. He's got his service weapon drawn. He's telling him to turn the car off, get out of the vehicle. The gentleman doesn't do that. He then starts to drive toward the officer. I don't think he gets hit, but there's a scenario where the officer is sort of now pinned between the wall of the White Castle, his vehicle, and the other gentleman's vehicle. He's again trying to get this individual to stop driving, to detain him, because he feels he's a threat to other people. He was driving erratically. He's not sure if he's under the influence, but it seemed to be pretty clear to him that he was under the influence of something. Later, he does find out that he had a blood alcohol level of 0.27, which is about 3.5 times the legal limit in most states, which is 0.08. He's at 0.27. That's a lot of alcohol in this man's system. Ultimately, what happens is as the gentleman finally kind of gets his way out of the vehicle behind him and the patrol car, he starts to drive towards the officer in order to get away from him. The officer steps back, and then he fires several shots toward his vehicle. I believe 2 of the shots hit his arms and his chest. About a block later, he sees the gentleman's vehicle hit another car, presumably because he had passed out or gone unconscious from the shots that were fired. Ultimately, he dies. It's a tragedy, and it's I think in every case, especially for us attorneys, whenever we read cases, whenever people read about cases that go up through the court systems, it is important to remember that these are real people affected by these situations. And so the gentleman dies, and it's a tragedy. The officer felt the need to use lethal force to protect himself from the gentleman who was driving erratically and also using his car as, some would say, as a weapon, because a 2-ton piece of steel can be a weapon, can be dangerous, but also to protect other people from this gentleman who was driving erratically, and as we know now, he ultimately got into an accident with somebody else. I don't know what happened to that other driver, if there was injuries or not, but ultimately the spouse, the widow of this gentleman, files suit against the police department and against that particular officer. And so then the court system goes through this whole question of qualified immunity, which essentially is this principle, this legal doctrine, that if you're a police officer working for a government agency, in this case it was Royal Oak Police Department, when you work for a government agency, you're doing the work of government. You're not doing your own personal work. You're not doing your own, personal leisure enjoyment type activities. You're doing something for the state or for the federal government if you're a federal police officer. And therefore, you have additional protections when you're working in the line of duty, when you have to do things that potentially can hurt people or even cause death. And sort of the key to qualified immunity is that it only applies when an officer is doing his or her job actively and appropriately. But the real question comes in with this case, which is, did the officer violate any clearly established constitutional rights in that particular situation? And it's sort of this buffer that police officers have, which they do have to understand what the Constitution prevents them from doing. You can't just randomly walk up to a person and shoot him in the back of the head if you're a police officer. But in certain situations where, as an officer, you have an obligation to protect other people, right? Protect and serve the community, but you also have the right to protect yourself, just like you and I, normal citizens, have the right to use self-defense to protect against someone who's threatening our lives. We can use lethal force to protect ourselves. And if we are confronted with lethal force, and if that means somebody else dies, it's a tragedy, but at the same time, the law is supposed to protect us in that situation, because we do have a right to protect ourselves, protect that which is our own sort of sacred dignity against an intruder. And so in this particular case with the Royal Oak police officer, according to some of the record and the testimony, he testified that he felt he had to use lethal force in shooting this gentleman because he felt his life was threatened and because he felt the lives of other people were threatened based on how erratic he was driving earlier and the fact that he was not obeying the police officer's commands to just stop the vehicle and get out, or stop and turn the vehicle off so we can talk. Interestingly, in the district court, the trial court, Eastern District of Michigan, the widow of the deceased individual actually won her argument, which was that this officer did not have qualified immunity, therefore he doesn't have legal protection. He doesn't have a legal shield to protect his actions, which killed that woman's husband. And the trial court essentially said, yeah, this officer can be liable, as can the Royal Oak Police Department. As in most cases, there was an appeal, and presumably the officer and the Royal Oak Police Department appealed this up to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, the federal court system. And in that court, which is usually, there's going to be a hearing with 3 judges, at least 2 have to agree to make a final decision. The Court of Appeals reversed the trial court's decision and held that actually the police officer does have qualified immunity, therefore liability cannot attach to him or the Royal Oak Police because there's not enough evidence that he violated clearly held constitutional rights of the individual deceased in that particular type of situation. And what was critical from my read of this, and I haven't really drilled down to get all the details right, so forgive me if you're an expert on this case or in this area of law, but what seemed to be critical was that there was no previous case that made the gentleman who ultimately ended up being shot and killed. There was no previous case law that gave him a particular constitutional right to do what he did, insofar as he, on several occasions, drove away from the officer, which would be fleeing and eluding. He resisted the officer's attempts at either detaining him, talking to him, or arresting him, so he resisted arrest. And he, again, fled the scene in a way that to the officer appeared that the officer could have gotten injured or some other innocent bystander could have gotten injured. So the Court of Appeals ruled that there was no clearly held constitutional rights for that gentleman. Therefore, what the officer did was presumably justified, and the shield of qualified immunity would stay in place. Those are the essential facts of that case, and that's the case that just the other day, when the widow applied to the Supreme Court for certiorari to basically ask the U.S. Supreme Court to hear her appeal to challenge that Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals decision, they declined to accept the case on appeal. And when you're seeking certiorari to the U.S. Supreme Court, that's the court of last resort. If they deny your application for appeal, essentially you're left with the lower court's decision, which in this case was the Sixth Circuit, which said qualified immunity stands, it protects the officer, it protects the Royal Oak Police, therefore no liability. Why is it important to understand some of the dynamics with qualified immunity? Well, I think it's important because there's a big debate right now around our country as to whether police should have qualified immunity when they're working to protect and serve and are put in difficult situations where sometimes they have to use lethal force. Hopefully they never do, but the reality is sometimes they do. They're confronted with situations with people who have their own weapons, or like this gentleman in this case we just talked about, as a vehicle that he can use and seems to be using as a weapon. We've seen some of these situations that are horrible over the last year or two where people have used their vehicle to drive into a parade or a crowd and have killed innocent people. So a vehicle can clearly be a weapon. But the debate about qualified immunity, some people will say, well, if police officers have qualified immunity, then they're going to be lawless. They don't have any accountability. They're going to shoot people without thinking and without any sort of responsibility or ultimate accountability. People on the other side say, well, listen, if a police officer can't have qualified immunity when he's doing his job or when she's out in the community trying to protect other people, and they can personally be held liable for doing something wrong, even if it's just negligent or potentially reckless instead of an intentional wrongdoing, then who's going to want to work for the police? How can you get police officers to go out and work and put themselves in harm's way when there's no guarantee that if they do have to engage someone in lethal force, that they're going to be protected. I think those are the two sides of the debate. Some states have actually started to discuss and begin passing laws that strip away qualified immunity for police officers in certain situations. Each state can pass its own laws in that regard. Then the courts in that state are going to have to deal with particular situations as they arise. But when I think about qualified immunity, just as a lawyer, also as a businessman, I also think about what many of us understand and appreciate, which is the corporate shield of running a corporation or a limited liability company. Any of you who are entrepreneurs or who have started a company know one of the critical components to actually forming a corporation to operate your business out of, instead of just doing the business yourself personally, or forming a limited liability company to run your business through, is that it protects you individually from individual personal liability when you're doing the work of your business. In other words, if you are running your business and let's say you make cookies, you sell cookies, people come into your store, you sell them online, you ship them out, and you're operating a limited liability company and your cookie store is operating through that LLC. Somebody buys your cookies, they get sick, turns out there's some sort of poison, let's say arsenic or something in your cookies, you had no idea, but you sold the cookies to that person, they got sick and died. Now their loved ones are filing a lawsuit against your business and against you personally. The corporate shield is what protects your own personal assets, so your home, your car if it's not a company car, your personal bank accounts. Maybe you have a boat. None of these things are related to your business. You're going to have a business account, right? You're going to have maybe a company car or some equipment in the business. Those are assets of the business. And so if someone successfully sues your business, they can take whatever money's in your business account or take away your business equipment, but they can't come and take your home from you. They can't come and take your own personal vehicle or your boat or your personal accounts. That's the shield that protects businesses. The corporate shield that protects people who want to do something in the community, but also need to separate themselves individually from the work of their business. And that's a well-founded, well-established, well-defined legal protection in the legal world when it comes to running businesses. And I think because qualified immunity is so similar to that officers are doing the work of a state agency or a federal agency. It doesn't give them a free pass to just go crazy and start shooting and killing and terrifying people. No, the business of the agency presumably is to do something good, like a police department. Here it was Royal Oak Police, to protect the people of Royal Oak, to hold individual citizens accountable when they violate the law or violate somebody else's legal rights. Those are good things. And because an officer is deciding to join the force in order to do the work of protecting other people and being paid through tax funds, the qualified immunity is what gives an individual an incentive, in other words, to know, I'm going to be protected if I work for this police department for my own personal liability. My home, my boat, my bank account, my children, they're going to be protected if I somehow screw up when I'm working on the police force. And if I do something that clearly violates somebody else's constitutional rights, then I can subject myself to personal liability. The shield of qualified immunity can be stripped away by a judge or a jury to then hold an officer accountable for clearly held rights, constitutional rights that are violated by that particular officer. So it still gives police an incentive to be well trained, to understand what the law says about people's constitutional rights, to understand when the use of force, and especially the use of lethal force, is justified under the law. And that requires police officers to take the time to study and learn and train and find better ways constantly to become better police officers. And I think one big problem that can be addressed without stripping away qualified immunity is to train police officers better and more often. The average officer gets about 4 hours of defensive tactics or combatives type training per year. 4 hours. Any professional who's out wielding a gun and has the job of dealing with difficult people in situations where there can be quick escalation in physical contact, physical confrontation, I would say needs a lot more than 4 hours of training. And I don't think that's on the individual police officers. I think that's on the police chiefs and the sheriffs who are leading the departments, the other police leaders in administration who could do a lot more for their police officers, to give them better protection, to give them more understanding, to give them more physical training, things like jiu-jitsu that I've talked about before, that gives you a better ability to keep your mind still when things get physical or escalate. I think that is where we could probably all agree that more can be done in terms of police training. And as an attorney, especially criminal defense attorney, one of the things I also want to see happen in police work is not only setting higher standards, but for a more regular and consistent level of training and accountability, so that when officers either don't feel well enough equipped to go out into what can be a hostile environment, that they get more training. And if they have certain weaknesses in some areas like physicality, okay, then let's work on that specifically and make it an individualized approach for police, so that each and every one of them, especially when police officers are seeing a shortage of officers on duty, and so you're going to have one officer in one patrol car very often. Some cities will have two and they can work with each other, support each other, and that's great. But if you have a police officer shortage, you've got one officer in one patrol car going out to do the work of police work, protect and serve, then I think we really owe it to our officers to give them more training, to help them be more equipped, more confident in order to use less force so that escalation doesn't occur, to do things that make sense in the community, that they can be a part of the community and support it and not feel like there's some antagonism. A lot of that, I think, comes down to the mindset, the mentality of police officers. And in this particular day and age of our society, there's a lot of challenges to police officers. So my hat goes off to them, and I want to support police. Yes, I'm a criminal defense attorney. It does not mean I hate police. There's a misnomer that so many people think. I respect police. Many police officers are my friends. But I do think there has to be more training. So I hope you found this helpful. I think qualified immunity for police officers is really critical. Otherwise, who's going to want to work for a police department if you know you go out there, you're going to be held personally liable for something you do wrong? I think it's a rational, principled law, and I think it's an important protection for our officers. I hope this was helpful. I hope you keep fighting for justice. Let's keep trying to make the criminal justice system better together.